And a pleasant good evening to you and good morning. I'm Zev Yaroslavsky, and welcome to America at a Crossroads. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and Janice Kaminer-Resnick. A special welcome tonight to our guest, Jonathan Blitzer. With all that's happening in Minneapolis and around the country, there is no more propitious time for a program dedicated to ICE and our country's immigration policies and practices. And we welcome as well our incredible moderator, Patt Morrison. Just a reminder, if you have a question for our guest during the course of the program, please type it in the Q&A function on your computer. A word about our upcoming programs. Next week on Thursday, not Wednesday, it's a special day to accommodate our guest schedule, we welcome extraordinary international expert Dennis Ross of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. The topic is Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East, what lies ahead. For decades, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping the United States' involvement in the Middle East peace process and dealing directly with the parties in negotiations. Dennis was a U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. There are few who know as much about the region and who are more qualified to brief us on the situation there than Dennis Ross. Remember, next week's program is on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern. In the coming weeks, we will welcome some of America's greatest political analysts and writers, Ron Brownstein, Susan Glasser, Carol Leonig, Max Boot, among others. We hope you'll register for these programs and encourage your friends and relatives to join us as well. This year, with the critical midterm elections right around the corner, the stakes are too high not to be fully informed and fully engaged. Again, a reminder, if you have a question for our guest, put it in the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to it during the course of the hour. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Patt Morrison, who will be moderating our conversation this evening. We are honored that Pat is one of our regular America at a Crossroads moderators. For more than 40 years, Pat has been an award-winning broadcast journalist with Emmys, Pulitzers, and Golden Mikes gracing her resume. She is a longtime columnist with the Los Angeles Times and a great friend of America at a Crossroads. Pat, the program is yours.
Zev, thank you. And thank you to all of you who watch these programs and who support these programs. And again, as Zev said, if you have a question for our guest, Jonathan Blitzer, throughout the course of the conversation, please put it in the Q&A box. We'd also like to know your first name and where you're from when we pose our questions, which will happen later in the hour that we spend time together. Jonathan Blitzer is a staff writer for The New Yorker, author of last year's book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here: The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. The New York Times named it a top 10 book of 2024. Of course, the immigration from Central America into the United States is a subject we'll take up a little later in the hour. And the topic, as we have sketched it out, getting beyond the border, how immigration became a political crisis. Jonathan, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for doing this, Pat. It's a real pleasure.
Of course, in this country, immigration was a crisis from the moment people other than Native Americans set foot on the soil of this continent. The earliest immigrants, we had the Spanish in Florida and the Southwest. We had the Puritans in New England, the Yankees in what is Spanish and Mexican California, what was then, the Irish and the Italians in New York, and then today. But I don't know that it's ever been as politicized or as theatricalized, if that's even a word, as it is now. We also see an inefficient operation, 10, 12 people trying to take one person away in ICE operations. But so the question is to go deeper than that. Why are we seeing now what we are seeing now?
Oh, well, there are so many ways of characterizing what we're seeing now, first of all. And that in turn means that there are, 1,000 ways of trying to account for how we arrived at this moment. But the idea of an immigration crisis itself is such a fraught notion. Immigration on its own is actually quite a positive thing. This is a country of immigrants. At least that's what we've told ourselves. That's certainly a big part of the country's DNA. Immigration, by all kinds of metrics, is an indisputed boon to the economy, to civic life, to so many facets of what I think most Americans hold dear. But the issue itself, the political issue, has become in recent years, I mean, always really, but I think especially in the last 15, 20 years, kind of increasingly, hostile, distorted, warped, and it's led to all kinds of wild policy outcomes. And I think the short explanation of how, the Trump administration has been able to really kind of cynically make use of the reality of mass migration in the world is to say that, first, when Trump ran back in 2016, he really leaned into this issue in a way that no mainstream political candidate ever had before him. Certainly, there were people on the fringes during primaries who leaned on this particular issue, who kind of made this claim that the border was overrun, that, criminals were overtaking American cities, all of these things which are demonstrably false and in many ways easily disproven, but as political myths start to have more and more power, particularly when you have on the Democratic side of the aisle a kind of reticence to engage with an issue that I think is incredibly complex and controversial. And the Trump administration, Trump himself, the people in his orbit have really decided that this is going to be the be all and end all issue for them. And they've really ridden it hard up until the present moment. And I have to say, comparing the first Trump term to the present one is itself a pretty stark reminder of how demonizing immigrants and villainizing immigrants is the kind of first step toward an actual assault on democratic principles and democratic norms. And we saw the kind of makings of this during Trump 1, but now it's an out and out assault on the very institutions of democracy. And I don't think you can separate that big question about the integrity of American democracy from the question of how we treat immigrants and how the public pushes back on a lot of the lies and the attacks on immigrants that you're seeing from the administration.
During the Republican convention, we saw a wave of mass deportation now signs among the delegates, but the numbers of people who are being deported don't seem to be as important as the optics and as what you just said. How much can we push and get away with as a template for what else we can undertake to undercut the Constitution?
I remain skeptical, or at least curious, about all of the polling that suggested that the mass deportation line in Trump's second campaign resonated with a majority of Americans. I mean, I realize, the surveys suggest that, and the election results prove that message certainly didn't discourage people from voting for Trump. And in many ways, just anecdotally, it seems like a lot of people were persuaded by this idea that a mass deportation campaign somehow meant a kind of restoration of law and order in the United States, a kind of more concerted effort to tamp down on chaos at the border. Now, we can go into all of the specifics of that, why I think it was, an incredibly cynical, racist ploy of Trump to use as a campaign slogan. But I also think that people didn't quite understand what the human reality of a so-called mass deportation campaign would be. And I think the polling would be, and I think is beginning to show, that the public response is very different when you actually see on a human level, on a day-to-day level, what these kind of political promises amount to. I mean, what they've amounted to in the last year have been nothing short of masked agents snatching people off the street without warrants, absolutely brutalizing people, being physical with them, assaulting them, disappearing them into jails across the country where there's no broader public access. Lawyers can't speak to clients, families can't see loved ones. You have people deported to countries that they've never been to in their lives. You have, families broken up. You have any number of things, and we can talk about all of them. We can talk about all of the implications, both human, political, and legal, of all the things that have happened. But the thing that was so striking to me during the campaign was, the phrase mass deportation. It gets repeated, or it got repeated so many times that it almost, I think, numbed people to what the actual human reality of it was.
Isn't that the
And
point?
we're seeing it now. That was exactly the point. And I think, I even see it just in a journalistic sense. There's this kind of almost academic question that there's a certain sort of brand of journalism that purports to try to answer about whether, Is Trump actually making good on his promises? How many people are actually being deported? This kind of sort of hair splitting around the numbers. And of course, to people in the administration, this is all just an exercise in in flaunting pure political power. And it doesn't matter what their ultimate goals were. I mean, Stephen Miller during the campaign floated the number of 1 million deportations a year. Even if the administration came close, which I don't think in any meaningful sense it ever could come close to that figure, the human wreckage of even that ambition is unspeakable, as we're all seeing on a day-to-day level. So I think it's one of those issues where the public, I actually think in some ways, and this is maybe counterintuitive, I think the public actually tends to react and respond in a way that is a bit more commonsensical sometimes than the political class does. I mean, I think I would challenge anyone to look at videos in Minnesota, coming out of Minnesota right now, and not feel a sense of dread, upset, alarm. And I actually think now, Democrats, not yet really any Republicans, have come out and decried this sort of activity.
But,
Yeah.
but let me ask, did the Trump administration not anticipate that there would be this kind of human reaction, that the Cubans in Florida would say, oh, yeah, well, we wanted him to deport them, but not us, or somebody in the Midwest. So we didn't mean that you would deport the woman who does the high school cheerleading uniforms, for example, or the guy who runs the pizza parlor. Has the administration atypically maybe thought several steps ahead to the political consequences, or doesn't care?
I don't think the administration has ever much cared, frankly, about what the human fallout is. And I think insofar as there is a calculation, and I don't think there really is, I think there's a kind of sense of malice and a sense of an agenda that they want to prosecute. And anyone who gets in their way, they're going to bulldoze. But I think insofar as there was a calculation made, the calculation was made that people would be outright outraged momentarily. They'd post about it on social media and then they would move on with their lives. Or at the same time, others would feel cowed by what they're seeing. I mean, right now, um, some of the most alarming actions taken by ICE, just literally to name the most recent scandalizing example, the murder of this mother in Minnesota, Renee Good, that is a U.S. citizen who was shot and killed by ICE agents. I just wrote a story this week about a Democratic congresswoman from New Jersey who was facing a 17-year prison sentence for allegedly assaulting ICE agents outside an immigration jail in her district where she was performing routine oversight. I mean, the way in which this kind of all-out assault on immigrants quickly starts to devour society writ large, it can't be overstated. But I do think that the administration's posture and plan was to intimidate and to scare and to bully and to go after really any critics. And that's exactly what they've done. And now we're beginning to see broad public pushback. But I think really up until this moment, there weren't political red flags, certainly inside the White House. They're prosecuting their agenda and they're very much undeterred by our outrage, upset, and protest.
So it seems that that kind of selective prosecution, which is a phrase that was used about the congresswoman, about the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, about a California attorney who was contested by the Trump administration simply for going to court and doing his job and defending his client, that the prosecution, that just pushing them into a corner is the point. Doesn't matter whether they're convicted or not. It's about grinding them down. On the one hand, you've got people who it seems like if you're brown, shut them down. And then
Mhm.
American citizens who are engaged in legitimate process of challenging this are going to be pushed into a corner by this administration and bullied or bankrupted.
You know, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, for someone like me who covers these issues and who's covered them since even before the first Trump administration, I sort of engage in this exercise just for my own kind of intellectual clarity of sort of trying to characterize some of the ways in which the current administration represents an absolute aberration, even from Trump one, which was itself an affront to all of our sense of democratic norms and legal principles and so on. And if I had to boil down the kind of current moment to a few things that just strike me as signal changes and departures in what the US government is doing, things that should really scare people, frankly. And I'm not saying this gratuitously to scare people, but things that really kind of keep you up at night. The first, I would say, is this idea now that no one is safe. In the first Trump administration, and I remember this vividly, one of the principles, one of the legal and organizing principles that advocates would share with immigrants and those who cared about the lives of immigrants was that if you, for whatever reason, were in some sort of liminal or precarious legal status or standing, you had to get your papers in order to some degree. You had to begin an application for a particular legal benefit. You had to plug yourself into the system because the idea then was that if you had some sort of pending legal case, you were temporarily shielded from enforcement actions until there was some sort of adjudication of your legal claim. It seems very straightforward. This is the principle of the rule of law. From Trump 1 to Trump 2, that has completely withered away. And now you're actually seeing people who are engaging with the legal immigration system who are getting snatched up and detained and deported. And the main government agency, there's a government agency that people don't hear about that works inside the Department of Homeland Security. There's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which is obviously well known to everyone, quite notorious at this point. There is another agency called Citizenship and Immigration Services. The full acronym is USCIS. And essentially, their job is to administer the legal immigration system. And for the most part, that has been for decades just a function of processing people's legal immigration applications. It's a fee-funded agency. So anytime someone applies for an immigration benefit, they pay a fee. That's what funds the agency. In the current administration, the government has weaponized this agency. And it's done it in two ways. First of all, it's done it to pretty much close off any possibility for people to get legal immigration status. So if you have a pending application, if you have a green card application, if you have a visa you've applied for, the aim, the very explicit aim inside this administration is to block those avenues by which people can regularize their status. But at the same time, they're using now these sorts of routine appointments. I'm talking about, the spouse of a US citizen who shows up for a routine green card appointment, who's getting detained at that appointment. I'm talking about people who have work authorization. If you go into detention centers, you pick the state. The types of people you're finding in these detention centers right now are people who have work authorization. These are people who have actual legal rights to be here. And the administration
has served in the US military.
I mean, the list is long, absolutely. People who've served in the U.S. military, people who have family members who are citizens, people who live in so-called mixed status families with people with different immigration statuses. But the point is, you have people who actually have played by the rules and who are playing by the rules, who are literally in the process of playing by the rules. They are showing up to an appointment to update their status, who are nevertheless getting arrested. And the principle behind that, to me, is nothing short of an absolute attack on the rule of law. And that's one of the things we're seeing now. Another thing I would say that is categorically so different and that flows from this first thing I've described is the fact that there have been a number of federal judges who have issued injunctions blocking particular administration policies in the immigration space. And the administration has simply ignored those judges' orders. I mean, this is the kind of bright constitutional crisis that everyone speculates about. It's happening in plain sight. And one of the through lines on a human level through all of this is that the administration is targeting and ICE agents, masked agents driving unmarked vehicles. Again, we're in unprecedented territory in American law enforcement, are racially profiling people. And that is the basis by which they're deciding who to go after at any given moment. And if when they go after someone, that person turns out to be a US citizen or turns out to actually have some sort of provisional immigration status, agents are basically ignoring them and locking the person up anyway. The last thing I would say, and it's an important point because you raised it when you framed the question, a whole other category of thing that we're seeing that I frankly did not expect to see so soon into this second Trump term is the idea of criminalizing political opponents who have taken any kind of issue with the administration's immigration policies. And so this is the charge that you're seeing. I mean, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has bragged about the fact that by the end of last year, the Justice Department had brought charges against more than 500 people for quote unquote assaulting or interfering with federal immigration agents. It's this idea that if you show up to protest an ICE action, if you try to document it, if you accompany an immigrant to an immigration hearing, that any of these behaviors, all of which we would recognize broadly as being not only First Amendment protected behaviors, but fundamental American behaviors, these things are, in the eyes of the Trump administration and the Justice Department, indicative somehow of people interfering, this is the government's language, interfering with or obstructing federal agents. And so the logic is very clear. The logic is as people get outraged and as people try to push back, you start to go after them. And so very quickly the circle starts to widen. And that to me is the principle that we're seeing behind the current dragnet.
And that even now people think you can go to the courts for remedy, but when you have an institution, the presidency, that will not follow the court orders. I mean, even Nixon in Watergate, when the Supreme Court ruled against him, he handed over the tapes and ended up resigning from office rather than being impeached and removed otherwise. Even Nixon is the kind of catchphrase. Even Nixon followed what it is that the courts told him to do after he exhausted his appeals. And there is no, as far as we can tell, and this is an argument that goes back 200 years, it's like Trump has always practiced. So yeah, what are you going to do about it? How are
Yeah.
you going to make me? Which is the argument of a 2-year-old as well. Make me do it. And so what remedies are there? I want to move on to something else in a minute, but what
Yeah.
remedies are there if you have my favorite word of 2024, contumacious public officials who thumb their noses at the laws that they have sworn to protect, but are there to undercut to all intents and purposes?
Yeah. Frankly, I don't know what the answer is in the current landscape. I mean, in a straightforward sense, the principle of, meaningful democratic resistance remains, the recourse remains in the courts. And by and large, federal judges have ruled favorably when people have sued the administration for any number of overly aggressive illegal policies, and we can talk about some of the specifics of them. Um, and sure, the administration has now fired back and actually, in many cases, personally attacked individual judges by name and made threats, and in some cases ignored injunctions. But it's not yet clear what will happen if those cases get fought out further in court. And I think that very much remains to be seen. And I think that's very clearly what the approach has been for people who've sued the government and who, in certain instances, have felt like, okay, the administration just ignored a federal judge's injunction or interpreted it in bad faith. It's to continue to press the legal case, which is one reason. I mean, I don't want to keep looping back into a kind of doom loop here of upsetting trends that we're seeing. But I just want to point out two things that were particularly important to me that happened basically in March of 2025. And they happened more or less simultaneously. And I think it's kind of revealing this particular sequencing here. So for one thing, you had in March the administration invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a law that has been invoked 3 times in the whole of American history, always during war times. And the administration invoked it on the grounds that mass migration constituted a form of hostile foreign invasion of the United States, and that therefore the president had the authority in this case to round up Venezuelans without due process, without evidence, accuse them of membership in a gang, and in this particular case to send them to a prison in El Salvador where many of them were brutally tortured. And in that case, a federal judge was responding to a lawsuit brought by the ACLU, and in real time issued an injunction the weekend of March 15th, saying to the administration, you have to pause the deportations under the Alien Enemies Act, because I need further briefing on what's happening. And we now know that there were internal communications inside the Justice Department where top lawyers said to each other, we can ignore this judge's ruling, forget it. And to be clear, the person who said that is now an appellate court judge nominated by Trump and confirmed by the Republican-controlled Senate. And that right out of the gate, I think, set the tempo and the kind of spirit of what we're seeing. I mean, this was March of 2025. At the same time that was happening, you also had the administration announcing that there'd be a series of executive orders and memoranda brought against prominent law firms who did work that the president personally took issue with. And rather than banding together these law firms and fighting what would have been an obviously illegal series of executive orders and presumptions of the president, a very, very prominent law firm, Paul Weiss, based in New York, made a deal with the Trump administration. That, to my mind, has actually raised very deep and worrisome questions about what the legal fight against the administration starts to look like. I mean, if you have powerful, law firms capitulating right out of the gate, what does that mean? What does it mean, not just across the board for sort of broad public discourse, but what does it mean practically? I mean, so many of the immigration cases brought during Trump 1, family separation, the travel ban, you name it, relied pretty extensively on pro bono legal help from major law firms. And right out of the gate, the administration kind of kneecapped any notion of that being a part of the resistance to its agenda. So it's a scary prospect. This is it. I mean, the stakes are high.
We will be getting to some questions of yours. If you'd like to put your question to Jonathan Blitzer, go to the Q&A box and put it in there with your name and where you're from, because we'd like to inform people of that as well. So there are judges who are saying they shall not pass to this administration, which may or may not pay attention to those. But there also is an incrementalism among some judges in some courts, and we've seen it in the Supreme Court giving extraordinary immunity powers to Trump, and some of the discussions under which ICE can operate. And one of them, everyone saw a video in the last week of an ICE agent stopping someone and literally saying it's because of your accent. And so can you detail what is being called a Kavanaugh stop, which I gather Brett Kavanaugh does not like very much, but does it extend into questionable constitutional territory, how it is that ICE is operating?
I think the short answer is yes. It extends into very shaky constitutional territory. The so-called Kavanaugh stops, which Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, kind of laid out in a abbreviated ruling in response to a lawsuit brought basically by actors in California when the Trump administration brought ICE agents and National Guardsmen to Los Angeles, and claimed basically that these law enforcement bodies were engaging in outright racial profiling. What Kavanaugh basically said was racial identity can be a factor that agents use in order to make an arrest of someone they suspect to be living in the United States unlawfully. That is a wild, wild idea. Extremely, I mean, that flies in the face of all of the most basic constitutional ideas we hold central to our democratic system. The thing that struck me the most, and I have to say, I mean, this is not something I observed myself, but in kind of reading different legal analyses of the Kavanaugh decision in that particular case, the thing that most struck me was that his opinion relied very heavily on the administration's own legal brief in the case. And Kavanaugh's ruling, uncharacteristically for a Supreme Court justice, didn't have citations or footnotes to actual facts or statistics, and instead was recycling a lot of the information that the Trump administration, the Justice Department, simply threw at the court. So, for example,
An
the
echo
Justice
chamber for its own purposes.
yeah, I mean, the Justice Department essentially said, look, it's not unreasonable for us when you start to do the demographic math of how large the undocumented population is in Los Angeles. And when you start to factor in the fact that a significant portion of the undocumented population is Latino, it stands to reason that, if you see someone who is Latino, if you see or hear someone who is speaking Spanish, that they might be undocumented. That was the government's argument. And those numbers, as far as I can tell, look, I spend a lot of my time looking into this stuff. I've never seen those numbers anywhere before. I mean, you're not going to find kind of rigorous analysis or research behind those figures. But the fact that those numbers just got injected into the Kavanaugh opinion remains to me one of the more scandalous aspects of that whole situation. But the broader logic, to zoom out for a second, you ask about, what is constitutional for ICE to do? First of all, one of the scarier things about immigration enforcement is that the president actually has always, even prior to this moment, enjoyed very broad latitude in what he is allowed to do in the immigration enforcement space. And part of that flows from a very rough and unfortunate logic that in the immigration context, non-citizens don't all enjoy the full range of rights that citizens do. And a lot of this has a geographic element. So, for instance, there is basically a principle that first emerged during the Clinton era that allowed the government to engage in a kind of abbreviated form of due process for people who had recently crossed the U.S. border or were within 100 miles of the U.S. border. And it basically allowed the administration, any government, any American administration, to perform what's called expedited removal. That's a form, I mean, exactly as it sounds, a form of rapid deportation that allows people fewer legal avenues to appeal and so on. One of the things the Trump administration has begun to do is it has essentially tried to transfer that logic to all locales inside the United States. And so this is one of the principles that it's pursued, and there's been a lot of pushback from federal judges, this idea that they can detain whoever they want indefinitely on the same principle that, well, look, we have reason to believe that anyone who's here unlawfully is someone who doesn't deserve the full rights of a citizen, and therefore we can apply this kind of rough borderlands logic, legal logic, to people who we encounter in cities. And it's obviously pretty striking to people, I would imagine, that you have border patrol agents operating in maybe not surprising to residents of Los Angeles per se, but like Chicago, Los Angeles, Minneapolis. I mean, the idea that federal border agents would be operating in the interior of the United States, following kind of rules of engagement that allow basically impunity that we don't allow law enforcement, local or state or federal law enforcement, is pretty startling. And so I basically think what's so alarming about how ICE operates is it has always operated at a kind of remove of how American law enforcement typically operates. People have fewer rights. The agency has much greater impunity. There's much less transparency. And now you're seeing that on a massive scale. And what's tempered it in the past have been administrations that have said, look, here are some rough rules of engagement. These are kind of lines we can't cross. These are principles for how we would carry out immigration arrests. Right now, what you're seeing from the current administration is the opposite. You're seeing the administration basically saying quite explicitly to agents, do whatever you want. We've got your back. And in any case of an agent, say, firing on an unarmed citizen or non-citizen, we will lie for you. And that's what's happened. The government is basically in court, in public statements, on television, just lying and not even really bothering, even when the information that we all can see with our own eyes contradicts it.
And just this afternoon, the Associated Press got hold of a memo um, that they're asserting their authority to forcibly enter people's homes without a judge's warrant. This is an internal ICE memo obtained by the AP, reversing longstanding guidance meant to respect constitutional limits on government searches allowed to force an entry into a residence based solely on a narrow administrative warrant. And we've seen people time and again saying, you shall not pass. You have to have this kind of paperwork in order to do the action that you are proposing to do. And now they are suggesting the administration, they're going to bulldoze that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've never, ICE, anyone who's covered Border Patrol, anyone who's covered any of these Department of Homeland Security enforcement agencies have for years, and this has been true honestly under Democrats as well as under Republicans, have had to reckon with the fact that oversight is abysmal, that these agencies operate with impunity, that the quality of agents working at these agencies is generally lower than other federal law enforcement. But what you're seeing now is not only all of that, but you're seeing what happened. You're seeing kind of the powder keg effect of all of those elements combining with this idea that the current administration is actually provoking these agents to act however they want. Um, I, for me, I have to say again, like I keep going back to this idea, and this is a journalistic principle of like trying to figure out, okay, what's different about this administration compared to the first Trump administration? Because the kind of worldview is in many ways consistent. I mean, the Stephen Millers of the world see immigrants and immigration in ways that are scandalous and offensive to me, but that are at least consistent, that follow a certain logic in his own mind. But the tactics now have changed and have morphed, and there are really no guardrails at all. And the idea now that the idea right now that federal judges, on a number of occasions, there was a case on Long Island in New York, there was a case in Chicago. I mean, there's example after example of judges actually chiding the government for legal filings that are full of lies and inaccuracies. Of every imaginable sort, but things that now, as people are seeing, thanks to posts that brave witnesses are putting on social media, you're seeing, okay, the government is saying that, someone was trying to attack an immigration agent, and then we see footage demonstrating very clearly that that wasn't happening. I mean, you're seeing these kinds of lies on every level, and the very deliberate message that is meant to send to ICE agents is, do whatever you want. We will
Well,
fight your fight.
considering that there is not even an investigation into the agent who shot and killed Renee Good, that instead the original focus was going to be on her and on her wife, or how dare they be
Yeah.
out there protesting the way they were, tells you a great deal about the kind of blanket immunity, the carte blanche perhaps that this administration wants to give to what is being regarded in some quarters as building a private police force answerable to Trump, not only as president, but as a kind of personal leader.
There was a Times piece maybe 5 months ago or something, a kind of essay, an ideas essay, that looked at the idea of masked federal agents in an international democratic context. And it basically asked a very simple question, which was, okay, do other democracies uh, rely on law enforcement agents who can perform their duties completely masked, completely sort of anonymized from public view? And the short answer, surprising probably no one watching this, was no. In fact, this puts us in the company of, Russia. This puts us in the company of, Peru in the early 1990s in the midst of a kind of civil war. I mean, there is no democratic principle for this kind of behavior, and that's where we are. And I have to say it's confounding from a journalistic perspective because there are so many ways of contextualizing how we got here. I mean, you take your pick. I mean, we can follow the institutional history of an agency like ICE. We can start with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in the early 2000s. There's so many kind of histories behind each of these developments that we've seen.
Mhm.
But I think it is important to remind people that the kind of behavior we're seeing now is unlike anything that we have seen before. And that's not to excuse abuses committed under Democratic administrations too, or prior Republican administrations, but we really are, to my mind, in uncharted territory.
It seems like during the first Trump administration, it was getting its legs on where presidential power actually lay and extending it to those limits, to the astonishment of people who had no idea that a president could still do legally X, Y, and Z. And
Mhm.
now it seems that the second term is devoted to transgressing those, especially when it comes to immigration. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's well said. I think that's well said. I was just speaking today to someone who used to work at this agency I mentioned earlier, Citizenship and Immigration Services. And, that's an agency, kind of a classic conversation for me to have with someone who worked at that agency. This is not an enforcement body, not until now. And a lot of the people who were forced out under the current administration worked at the agency under Trump 1. And what they said during Trump 1 was, look, for career civil servants like ourselves, we could find a lot of the policies the administration was pursuing to be completely abhorrent to our values, completely counterproductive to any sort of policy goals, legally attenuated, if not illegal, whatever. But there were channels that the administration still went through. Now, the degree to which those channels carried deep weight, who can say? I mean, the family separation policy, for instance, you know, that happened, you know, through a perversion of the so-called established channels at these different enforcement agencies at the Department of Homeland Security. So, the existence of these channels alone doesn't mean that there can't be horrific abuses that are committed. But for example, this person told me, look, there was rulemaking that we engaged in. We would file drafts of things. We had to observe a public comment period once a regulation was introduced. There was some notion that there was at least a legal process that had to be followed, or there had to be some lip service paid to it. Whereas now the idea is not only if there's a line, we're going to cross it, but we are going to sabotage the institutions that previously held up these basic guardrails. And so this agency, the agency that administers the legal immigration system, it will not surprise you to learn that this was one of the agencies that was most brutally affected by all of these cuts to the federal bureaucracy taken in the early days of the current administration. And as this person I spoke to today said, the logic there was very much we are going to incapacitate the legal immigration system so that even after this term ends, if it ends, even after this particular administration fades away and gives way to the next administration, there won't even be the capacity for people. There won't even be the staff. There won't even be the training. There won't even be the resources or the money to stand back up the legal immigration system. So I think what we're seeing, I think what you said is accurate, and we can parse it depending on the agency, depending on the context in different ways, but all of the consequences are grave.
Let's get to some of the questions, but to your point there, the whole argument certainly since the culture wars of the 90s and maybe much earlier into the 50s about how government does not function. If you are in charge of government and you tank it, if you crash government, you have just
Hmm.
proved your tenet that government does not work. And so this is the same kind of destruction has been happening in a lot of other government agencies apart from immigration, but we're seeing it with immigration in a way we do not see it in hallways and offices of other offices that have been decimated by this
Hmm.
administration.
Hmm.
So let's
Yeah,
go
that's also.
to some questions. Michael and Tarzana wants to know whether you think the Supreme Court will act to address the constitutional violations of current immigration policies. We've already spoken about the Kavanaugh stop, but beyond that,
Yeah. I wish I knew, and this is going to sound like I'm dodging the question. I mean, I'm not a constitutional expert, and I'm certainly not um, I don't even know what the word is, a court watcher. I don't have a sense of the particular personalities of the justice among the justices and how they'd rule. I- their past behavior has not led me to feel like they're eager to impose any checks on the president when it comes to some of his grosser immigration policy violations. Again, I think the overwhelming reality of presidential power is that in the immigration context, the president actually enjoys quite a bit of latitude. Now, of course, this president goes farther than anyone. And so I think very plainly has stepped well beyond the bounds of what's legally allowed. Whether or not the justices push back is an open question. One of the biggest cases that I'm very anxiously awaiting a ruling on is the birthright citizenship case. I mean, the administration just came right out in an executive order and basically violated the 14th Amendment, just blithely in the form of an executive order saying, the idea that people born on US soil are automatically US citizens is not a principle that we particularly care about. The Supreme Court took up that case. And I, like so many others now, immediately am incredibly anxious because my thought is, okay, is the court taking this up to police this bright constitutional line, or is it taking it up because um, it wants to offer some sort of novel legal theory to give succor to the president's argument? I, I just don't know. I do wonder, I have to say, I wonder if the accumulated effect of the administration very openly defying lower court orders has any sort of impact on how the Supreme Court justices think about any constitutional questions. Some of the judges, we assume that we assume in part because this has just been the reality of it, and in part because the administration says this all the time, that the judges who are pushing back or issuing injunctions against the administration are judges who are appointed by Democrats. That's true in many cases. In many cases, it's not. I mean, I just mentioned earlier this example of a court on Long Island that chastised the administration lawyers for misrepresenting basic facts in a case. That was a Trump appointee who did it. Some of the judges who have been in the most open kind of confrontation with the administration are people who are in very high standing with the Supreme Court justices, who are well respected among conservative jurists. One wonders if that is a factor at all in how the justices see this administration and the reality of how it's operating, as opposed to these kind of very sanitized, almost academic questions of what it might be able to do with whatever sort of perverse legalistic reasoning. The short
Because
answer is I don't know.
but the court should be interested in its own and has given some evidence of it in its own validity in the regard in which it's held, which at this point is pretty low.
That's right.
So we
That's
have,
right.
let's see. Nancy wonders what the true aim of some of these immigration policies is. Are they economic? How do they benefit his donors? Low tax Republicans? Are they to Trump's advantage simply from the optics point of view?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's always been this tension inside the Republican Party, and specifically with what we've seen in the last decade or so with Trump, between the kind of Chamber of Commerce wing of the party, the kind of big business or the business aligned interests of the party, and this more nativist populist wing. And it's true that those wings are at odds on the immigration issue. And I have to say that going into the current administration, that was one of the questions I had, was whether there was a kind of economic pain threshold for some of Trump's Republican supporters that would lead them to break ranks with him on this obsession, of immigration enforcement at all costs. Because there are obviously a whole slew of negative economic consequences that flow from this kind of indiscriminate enforcement. And I do think that people, donors, big agriculture, you name it. You can the customer service sector, hotel chains. I mean, you could almost just pick the industry. Almost all of them depend on immigrant labor, and have historically and will continue to. Um, the construction industry, for instance, a huge element of construction in the United States depends on undocumented labor.
Well,
What
we've seen
happened?
videos of ICE agents, trying to corral people working on putting new roofs
Yeah.
on houses in Florida and projects that have been abandoned because of it. So clearly, some of the people who are corporate supporters of Donald Trump may not be benefiting from some of these policies.
I expected there to be clearly naively more pushback from those kinds of corporate interests, and to date we've not seen it. Now I don't know what's happening behind closed doors. Um, I think for as long, I mean, I don't want to seem to oversimplify this, but but I think it's fair to say that for as long as Stephen Miller is in his particular role in the White House, the kind of the dominating ethos and logic inside the administration is going to be a white nationalist, nativist approach.
Stephen
And
Miller, grandson of immigrants
that's
fleeing
right.
persecution of Jews.
That's right. So that raises the question then of, what are the political benefits for the current administration? I mean, because clearly humanity is not a factor, and reason isn't a factor, and economics aren't a factor. I think for the president, it's a question of power and strength. I think for him, and this is true of Stephen Miller as well, I think the immigration space is one of the key vectors by which or through which the president can further consolidate power in really every sense. And that's what we're seeing. And so I think that continues to be how the president looks at the issue and how his key advisors look at the issue. And I'm not seeing any sign of, corporate or other conservative interests inside the party or inside Congress, pushing back in any kind of meaningful way.
Susan and Adam asked pretty much the same question about whether the Insurrection Act would be invoked. And this seems like as almost as bright and shining a line as birthright citizenship, because the conditions under which it had been invoked before were extreme. And there was always some pushback in consequence. But this seems to be Trump saying, hey, look what I can do under the law, and I'm going to try to get away with it.
This is one of those things where you look back at what he said during the 2024 campaign and all of the things that we're seeing, he said he would do. Um, and part of you thinks, okay, well, he's just saying this. He doesn't know. Part of you is, of course, very alarmed by the fact that, like, this is not someone who particularly cares where any legal lines are. The Alien Enemies Act was one thing he talked about on the campaign trail. I was shocked. Again, this just betrays my naivete. I was shocked when it actually played out in real time. The Insurrection Act he's talked about a lot. In fact, even beyond the 2024 campaign, you may all remember, during the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, in the summer of 2020, one of the flashpoints for the then almost outgoing Trump administration were using federal agents who worked at the Department of Homeland Security to police protests. And at that time, it wasn't so much, ICE agents or Border Patrol agents or any of the people you're seeing now on the streets of American cities, but there were other DHS agencies. There's an agency called the Federal Protective Service, where the idea is those agents are quite literally protecting federal property. And those guys were on the scene of domestic protests. And I think if Miller and Trump and other stakeholders of that bent inside the first Trump White House had their way, they would have. I think they were very tempted even to invoke the Insurrection Act then, and I think were only brought to heel because there were still people in the administration who were, well, let's call them institutionalists, who were just a modicum more oriented toward kind of respecting legal norms and rules, and who prevented the administration from pulling that particular lever. But Trump has been itching to pull that lever since at least 2020. So it's not a surprise to see him threatening it now.
Um, there are a lot of people who are wondering in our questions from our audience about, they feel frustrated that there's nothing that they can do. Is there a critical mass of anything that will slow down, stop? We're not even talking about reverse at this point. Some of these policies. Is the administration, in fact, taken aback by some of the public, protest and resistance that they have seen, which is what maybe has pushed them to decide to prosecute and crack down the way that they have?
Okay, so I have three thoughts on this. My first is that during the first Trump administration, the family separation policy that sort of was first fully exposed in the spring of 2018 led to public outcry that I've really never seen the likes of in the immigration space. I think people were outraged and scandalized and obviously profoundly upset and even traumatized by the idea that the government was deliberately separating parents and children at the southern border. I have never seen public outcry like that. And it led not only to, gains for Democrats, it led not only, I think, to the diminishment of Trump's brand going into the 2020 political brand going into the 2020 election, but it led very concretely to certain rules that, okay, now the administration is ignoring, but were written into statutes. For example, rules allowing members of Congress to make unannounced visits to detention centers. That's now a part of federal statute. Now, sure, the administration is fighting it. That's going to be a whole legal case. A bunch of Democrats have sued. A judge found in favor of the Democrats. The Trump administration is now ignoring that judge. Whatever. We're in the midst of that fight. But, the broad public outcry led Democrats to take this issue on and to, in this particular case, rewrite some of the language of appropriation statutes to make sure that that oversight authority was enshrined and protected. Through all of that, Stephen Miller was giving interviews saying that he believed that if the administration had been allowed to continue that policy of family separation, eventually you'll remember they were ordered to stop by a federal judge. But Miller had always contended that if they were allowed to follow that policy through to its logical conclusion, or whatever, to a fuller iteration of that aim, that this is Miller speaking, 90% of the public would support the administration. Now, okay, obviously that's crazy. The reason I bring it up is to say that Miller is, this is going to sound ridiculous. It's going to sound ridiculously obvious, but Miller is majorly out of step, even with conservatives in the United States. This is someone
he's a Santa Monica kid, and he has been ever since he denounced the fact that the loudspeakers in his school deliver the announcements in Spanish and in English.
Right. That's right. This is this is not me, trying to sort of niggle at him as a person, but this is an unlikable person who is not, doesn't have his finger on any kind of basic human pulse of sort of normal behavior. And so the idea that even in the midst of 2018, he was saying, well, this is only blowing up in our face because we weren't allowed to go the whole distance, I think reveals the political instinct there. And I think it should be seen for what it is, which is very scary that someone doesn't care what the public response is. But I also think it shows a certain vulnerability because that is the definition of unhinged orthodoxy, that like it's someone pursuing that kind of fanaticism without regard for any of the political consequences. And
And
so I
and
do,
forgive me, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here because we're approaching the end of the hour, and I'd like
yeah.
to get another question. So I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Sure, sure, sure. So my point is that, I do think this administration is going to push and push, and I do think it is important for the public to demonstrate that this is not being done in its name, and that, this is not where people are. I think that emboldens, by the way, Democrats to push back. I think Democrats habitually are very uncomfortable staking out ground in the immigration space. I think it's been a huge weakness of theirs. And I think it's a misinterpretation of the 2024 election results, too. I think the Democratic establishment felt like Biden had been too permissive at the border, and that a lot of what we're seeing now is a result of that. And so I think the public can set the tone in a way that then leads Democratic office holders to actually use their prominence to push on some of these issues. That's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll
And
say is, I know we have to speed up. The second thing I'll say is, you know, the situation is not analogous, but something that was very profound for me. Pat told me beforehand that we should have at least 1 minute of positive thinking in this conversation.
you try to
And
wrap up with that to leave people on a high note.
yeah, so I'm close, and we're close to the end, and so I've got my minute. Um, the One of the most profound parts for me about the research I did for my book was learning about the American sanctuary movement in the 1980s. This was a broad movement
Some
of
of it centered in Los Angeles at the
that's
original
right.
Closet
That's
Church.
right. Exactly. Exactly. And the idea was essentially at the time that the Reagan administration was ignoring the basic tenets of the 1980 Refugee Act, and large numbers of Central Americans who were fleeing repression in their home countries were being denied asylum, even though they actually had very strong legal claims, because the Reagan administration couldn't grant those people protection because it would mean acknowledging that U.S. allies in the region, these repressive military regimes, were brutalizing their own populations. And
Yeah.
so a broad coalition of faith leaders and lay people all across the country started to engage in different forms of advocacy and activism around asylum, of all things, not a political winner historically. And that was a major tone setter in conversations, political conversations in America, led to major legal reform. And again, that did not begin with Democratic lawmakers in Washington. It began with people on the streets of American cities, pushing back. And that to me is an incredibly powerful example.
And the repercussions still with us. If I can get maybe a 1 minute answer to this, and I know that's complicated, but I remember covering in Orange County in the late 80s that Republicans sent uniformed guards to polling places to scare away Latino voters, even legitimate Latino voters. They had to walk it back. They were fined and I think penalized. And now we have a question from Eric about ICE agents, whether this is a trial run for ICE agents to do the same thing at polling places in the 2026 and maybe 2028 elections. Have you any fears on those grounds?
Wow. I mean, I don't know. I myself, obviously, as you're all able to glean, like a kind of pessimist about ICE these days, and maybe always. Um, I I haven't thought about that particularly. I've been concerned about ICE criminalizing dissent and going after, anyone who's trying to bear witness or express disapproval of the administration's policies and so on. Um, is it a stretch to imagine that they'd turn out at polling places? No, I don't think it's a huge stretch. I also think there are a number of things the current administration can do to make it much harder for people to vote in the midterms and to vote in 2028. And that those things are almost existentially more pressing than the prospect of ICE agents trying to intimidate people at the polling place.
Yeah.
But, look, the administration, Trump has always been, I mean, Miller has been obsessed with this forever. Trump has kind of tapped into it when it's convenient. One of the things members of the administration have always advocated, again, flying in the face of all evidence to the contrary, is that non-citizens vote in large numbers. That is a lie that has motivated a lot of deliberately
Yes.
disenfranchising policies taken
Yeah.
by Republicans generally and this administration particularly. So I don't think it's a lark to think along these lines, but it's not something I've thought about
Certainly not
concretely.
not top of the list of the to-do list there. So Jonathan Blitzer's book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, The Making of a Crisis. You have to come back. We have to talk more about this. There's still much that we left on the table, and I hope you'll be able to join us again.
I'd love it. Thanks so much, Pat.
I'm Patt Morrison. You can find more about these programs coming up. There you see some on the screen, and you can also find out how you can support them yourself. We love your questions. We hope to get to more of them every time, but you're so good with them. We don't always have time to do that, but we'll keep trying. Thank you for joining us tonight on behalf of the whole team here.